In the debate for around 7 minutes, please, Mr Johnson.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. In the few months since I first confirmed to Parliament that I had ADHD, I've been touched and slightly overwhelmed by the number of people who have told me, first of all, thank you for speaking up, but also to comment on what they perceive as my courage and bravery in speaking up. I have to say, I feel slightly guilty because I'm not sure I was brave at all. You see, the thing about having ADHD is you have very poor impulse control. And I have to say, I just got very angry about the press coverage of ADHD, and I felt I had to speak up. And I have to say, I quite often find myself, when I find myself looking at something I think is unfair or unjust, I quite often speak before I've thought about whether it's sensible or not to do so. But I have to say, I think that's probably quite a good thing for an MSP, and I'll touch on that later on. But, Deputy Presiding Officer, I've got angry again because Netflix released a documentary called Take Your Pills just a month or so ago. And it's a sensationalist documentary. It explores a trope around there being an explosion of diagnosis of ADHD, that the medication is unnecessary, and it compares ADHD medication to crystal meth. It peddles and perpetuates myths that those of us with ADHD battle against almost on a daily basis, that ADHD isn't real and that the meds do more harm than good, and also that doctors are handing out pills like sweeties. Now, as part of speaking up, writing articles and speaking at events that I've done since speaking out in Parliament, I've told my story about how ADHD and the diagnosis has been empowering, how it's transformed my life and how medication has been a vital first step within that. But the thing is, I'm not alone. This isn't a rare condition. 1 in 20 people are like me. Everyone in here will know other people with ADHD, whether it's friends or in classrooms. There'll be at least 2 or 3 children with ADHD. So the fact that this is such a prevalent condition, but there's so little understanding, the fact that people will know more about the myths regarding ADHD rather than the facts just isn't right. The very fact that this is, I think, the first time ADHD has been debated as a topic on its own in this Parliament, I think isn't right. So that is what we are here to do today, to bust the myths surrounding ADHD and to build the understanding that I think we need. So let's start with the facts. I have ADHD, and I've been taking methylphenidate, which most people will know is Ritalin, every day for the last 5 years. So that's the fact. Let's deal with the fiction. I'm not a victim. I'm not looking for special treatment. My brain is just wired up in a slightly different way. The things that most people find easy, mundane, routine, people like me find incredibly difficult. I'm not constantly running around bouncing off the walls like a naughty child. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is just that. It is a composite of different traits. Part of it is about inattentiveness. So it's as much about that daydreamy child at the back of the classroom who isn't concentrating at all as it is about the naughty child running around. And I'm much more on the inattentive side of the spectrum rather than the hyperactive side. I'm not making it up, and I feel pain that I have to say that. But ADHD is real. It's not an excuse for bad parenting. It's not something that I'm seeking special treatment for. It's not a social phenomenon. If you scanned my brain, my prefrontal cortex just isn't as active as most people's. My brain doesn't produce enough dopamine. There are genetic markers which are highly predictive of ADHD. And finally, I take ADHD medication, but I am not a zombie. The myth that somehow by giving people ADHD medication they get turned into incommunicative zombies is just false. ADHD medication, in the most part, is stimulant-based. It is the complete opposite of a sedative. Now, if that sounds strange, let me just put it to you like this. How many people in this chamber, before they start work of the day, have a cup of coffee, or when they sit down to write a speech, drink a cup of tea? We take stimulants because it's a way of helping our brains deal with mundane and slightly banal chores. It's about keeping our brain interested in what we have at hand. And that's especially important and especially true of ADHD medication. And it's also why it's so important as a first step to learning the skills, to learning the techniques that you need to deal with the condition on top of the pills. Because without taking the pills, you can't do that. So many people ask me, what is it like to have ADHD? What goes on in your head? And the best way I've got of explaining it is, it's a bit like a record player. but your needle keeps jumping out the groove. So you know what track you want to play, but the needle just won't stay in there. And medication is the first step you need to do to keeping the needle in the groove. But there's another way of looking at that record analogy. It's that people with ADHD don't just look at an individual track at a time. They like looking at the whole album. People with ADHD view the world in macro, not micro. We like looking at the big picture. We see the connections. We are constantly finding tangents and different ways of looking at things. And that allows us to see things that other people don't. And again, I spoke at the beginning that being slightly inhibited about speaking up is useful for being an MSP. But I think seeing that bigger picture and those connections is vital for my work. And I think allows me to bring something else to this job. But let me say one other thing about being a politician. And 5% of people have ADHD, so there will be other people. And I just hope that this debate gives other politicians the courage to either maybe get a diagnosis, or if they have one, speak up about it. But let me say one other thing about that 5%. Well, 5% of the population have ADHD, and the prison population is 20%. Now, I just want people to think about that. That's 4 times higher. So what is going on? And I think, at the very least, it points to a failure, a social failure, a failure of all our understanding, but also a policy failure. For people to end up in that situation, for such a high prevalence, something is not right. But there is one brutal and blunt fact, is that while the myth is that we overdiagnose ADHD, nothing could be further from the truth. We underdiagnose this condition. 1% of the adult population have an ADHD diagnosis. The proportion is very similar for the child population. That is a massive underdiagnosis of this condition and an under-medication of this condition. And the myths that get peddled stop people from seeking the help and getting that first step, that vital first step which medication provides, that they need to deal with their condition and the consequences that it has. Medication, in the words of NICE, is a first-line therapy. And I think that's what needs to be borne in mind. So as I close, Presiding Officer, we need to destigmatise medication. We need better access to mental health services. And we need more than just medication. It's about pills and skills. Now, if there was one positive outcome to the very negative, I think, effect that the Netflix documentary had, was this, is that people took to social media, people like me, to speak up about the positive impact that pills had on their life, about what it had enabled them to do. And that if you look up the hashtag #ITakeMyPillsBecause, you will see those testimonies and the positive experiences that people have. And it outtrended the hashtag for the documentary itself. So let me just say this. I take my pills because they enable me to function. They free up my head to develop the skills and learn to cope with my condition. But most importantly, I take my pills because they have transformed my life and they've transformed the life of my family. Thank you.